We bought Ballpark, Oscar Mayer, and Kirkland Signature hot dogs and actually read what's inside each one, and the results genuinely surprised us. The most iconic hot dog brand in America, the one with the famous jingle and the fleet of giant rolling wieners touring the country, doesn't even contain beef in its classic wiener. Neither does the other major grocery store name sitting right next to it on the shelf. Only one of these three brands is actually making its hot dogs from single ingredient meat, with nothing mechanically separated anywhere on the label. What's actually in a hot dogs feel like the most straightforward food in the entire grocery store. Meat, a casing, a little smoke flavor, done. But three of the biggest names on the shelf right now, Ballpark, Oscar Mayer, and Kirkland Signature, tell three very different stories once you actually flip the package over and read the ingredient panel instead of the brand name printed above it. We bought all three, pulled the actual labels, checked the ownership behind each company, and compared them side by side. Then, because a hot dog aisle has more than three options in it, we found two more brands worth knowing about too, one with a genuinely wild ownership twist of its own. Every ingredient list in this video comes straight off the actual package, not a summary, not a guess, so feel free to go check your own fridge against it while we go through these. Let's get into it. What mechanically separated actually means before ranking anything, one phrase is going to come up constantly, and it's worth actually understanding instead of just reacting to. Mechanically separated meat is created through a process called advanced meat recovery, where machinery presses or scrapes the remaining meat off animal bones after the primary cuts have already been removed, producing a soft, paste-like meat product rather than whole muscle tissue. The USDA does regulate it. The meat has to meet a specific calcium content limit to even qualify as meat rather than a separate category, and it remains legal in poultry products nationwide, though it's been restricted specifically in beef since regulatory changes tied to food safety concerns in the 2000s. None of that makes it inherently unsafe under current USDA rules. It's simply a cheaper, more efficiently recovered form of meat than a whole muscle cut, which is exactly why it shows up so often at the more affordable end of the hot dog aisle, and exactly why its presence or absence on a label tells you something real about what you're actually paying for. Whole muscle meat, cut directly from the animal without that recovery process, tends to cost more to produce and typically delivers a firmer bite and a more pronounced flavor, which is the entire reason a lot of premium hot dog brands specifically advertise that they skip mechanically separated meat altogether, treating its absence as a selling point rather than a footnote. Ballpark, owned by Tyson Foods, by way of a 2014 acquisition of Hilscher Brands, which itself used to be the Sara Lee Corporation, which had owned Ballpark since buying it from High Grade back in 1989. The brand actually started at Tiger Stadium in Detroit in 1957, when the Tigers hot dog supplier got so popular with fans that it expanded into grocery stores by 1959 under the Ballpark name. In 2017, Tyson announced it was moving Ballpark to what the company called Clean Label, removing added nitrites, nitrates, byproducts, and fillers from its meat hot dog line. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Ballpark sells at least two very different hot dogs under the exact same trusted name. The classic Franks, the ones most people default to, list mechanically separated chicken as the very first ingredient, followed by pork, water, and corn syrup. No beef anywhere on that label. Then there's Ballpark's actual all-beef Franks, a completely separate product, where the ingredient list starts with beef, water, and corn syrup. No mechanically separated anything. Same brand, same red script logo, same grocery store shelf, two meaningfully different products depending entirely on which specific package you grab. If you've been buying Ballpark for years, assuming the name itself meant beef, because that's the association the brand's entire baseball heritage seems to invite, the classic version specifically has never actually been that. That's not a hidden secret exactly, it's printed right there on the package. But it's also not something the branding does much to clarify at a glance. both bags look similar enough on a crowded shelf that grabbing the wrong one out of habit is an extremely easy mistake to make, especially moving fast through a grocery run with a cart full of other things and a kid asking for snacks. The 2017 Clean Label announcement was specifically about removing certain preservatives and fillers, and Tyson deserves real credit for that change, since it was a genuine reformulation rather than just a marketing refresh. What it didn't change is the fundamental structure of the classic line, which still leans on mechanically separated poultry as its foundation rather than whole cuts of beef or pork. Sodium nitrite is still present as a curing agent in both versions, which is standard across almost the entire category, and exists specifically to prevent the growth of a particularly dangerous bacterium. So its presence alone isn't the concerning part. What's actually worth noticing is simpler than any of that. Read the first ingredient. If it says mechanically separated chicken, you're holding a completely different product than the all beef version sitting one shelf over, no matter how similar the two packages look from 3 feet away in a crowded aisle. Tyson Foods, worth remembering, built its entire reputation and its stock ticker on chicken, not beef. So, in a strange way, the Ballpark Classic Frank being chicken forward under the hood makes a certain amount of sense once you know who's actually behind the label. It's just not the story the vintage baseball branding is selling you. Worth saying plainly, none of this makes the Classic Franks dangerous or something to panic about. Mechanically separated poultry is a completely legal USDA regulated product, and plenty of people genuinely prefer the softer bite and milder flavor it produces over a firmer, more assertive all-beef dog. This isn't a food safety story, it's a labeling clarity story, and Ballpark happens to be a particularly clean example of it because the brand sells both versions side by side under one identity, which makes the contrast easy to actually verify yourself the next time you're in that specific aisle instead of trusting memory or habit. Price-wise, the two versions typically land within $1 of each other per package, which makes the ingredient gap even more worth checking. Since you're not necessarily paying less for the mechanically separated version, you're just getting a different product for a similar price depending on which one happens to be in stock or at eye level that day. If taste and nostalgia are what you're after, Classic Franks aren't a bad hot dog by any reasonable standard. Millions of people grew up on them and still reach for them every summer without complaint. But if the specific reason you reach for Ballpark is an assumption that the name itself guarantees beef, this is exactly the brand where that assumption needs a second look before it goes in the cart. It's also worth remembering that Ballpark sells jumbo and Angus variations beyond just these two core lines, and each one carries its own separate ingredient list, so the safest habit isn't memorizing which specific product is which, it's just checking the first word on whichever package happens to be in your hand that day, every single time, since the branding alone genuinely won't tell you. Oscar Mayer, owned by Kraft Heinz, and arguably the single most recognizable hot dog brand in American advertising history, thanks to a jingle most people over a certain age can still sing without trying, and a genuine fleet of Wienermobiles that have been touring the country since the 1930s. That level of brand recognition creates a specific assumption in a lot of shoppers' minds that Oscar Mayer, being the classic default, we've always bought this hot dog, is naturally the most straightforward, meat-forward option in the aisle. Pull the label on Oscar Mayer's actual classic wieners, the flagship product, the one the brand's own marketing calls the original, and the first ingredient is mechanically separated chicken, followed by mechanically separated turkey, then pork, then water, then corn syrup. There is no beef in Oscar Mayer's classic wiener at all. None. The hot dog most associated with the word classic in the entire American hot dog category is built primarily from mechanically separated poultry. That's worth sitting with for a second because Oscar Mayer does sell beef franks too, a separate product line where beef actually shows up first on the ingredient list, but that's not the one carrying the word classic on the package, and it's not the flavor most associated with the brand's decades of cultural dominance. The company markets its classic line around the phrase no fillers or byproducts, and that claim genuinely holds up. Mechanically separated chicken and turkey aren't fillers in the legal or nutritional sense. They're recovered meat, just not whole muscle cuts and not beef. Kraft Heinz has also removed added nitrates and nitrites from the current classic formulation specifically, replacing them with nitrates that occur naturally in cultured celery juice, a substitution that's become standard across most of this category over the last decade, and that functions almost identically to the ingredient it replaced, just under a different name on the label. Oscar Mayer has been part of Kraft's portfolio since 1981, and the brand itself dates back even further to a German immigrant named Oscar Mayer who opened a small meat market on Chicago's North Side in the 1880s. The Wienermobile, first built in 1936, has become one of the most successful pieces of mobile marketing in American corporate history, and Kraft Heinz still sends a small fleet of them across the country every year, largely staffed by recent college graduates who apply for a job literally called hot dogger. All of that brand equity, the jingle, the Wienermobile, the decades of commercials, is built on top of a classic wiener that, ingredient for ingredient, is closer to a chicken and turkey product than anything resembling a beef frank. This isn't really a story about Oscar Mayer hiding anything. The ingredient panel is sitting right there in plain English on every package, required by federal law to be listed in descending order by weight. It's a story about how thoroughly decades of advertising can shape an assumption that never actually matched the product underneath it. Ask most people what Oscar Mayer hot dogs are made of, and beef is very likely the first word out of their mouth, purely because the brand feels like the most all-American, default, classic option on the shelf. The actual answer, printed right there in plain type, is poultry first, pork second, and no beef at all in the specific product carrying that reputation. If you've been feeding your family Oscar Mayer classic wieners specifically because you assumed beef, it's worth checking the actual bag currently in your fridge before your next cookout. To Kraft Heinz's credit, the company has been transparent about reformulating the line over the past several years specifically to remove artificial preservatives, and the resulting product genuinely does what it says on the front of the package. No artificial flavors, no byproducts, no fillers in the strict USDA sense of that word. The gap here isn't between the label and the ingredient list. Both are accurate and both say exactly what's inside. The gap is between decades of cultural association and the actual product, which is a subtler kind of mismatch than an outright false claim, but arguably a more interesting one, since nobody had to lie for it to happen. The advertising simply never corrected an assumption it never technically made, and several generations of shoppers filled in the blank with beef because that's what a hot dog is supposed to be made of, in the same way most people assume Ballpark started as beef too. It's a genuinely strange position for the single most advertised hot dog brand in the country to be in, instantly recognizable, deeply nostalgic, and built on a formula that, if you described it to someone without using the brand name at all, would sound a lot more like a chicken and turkey cold cut than the beef frank most people picture when the jingle starts playing in their head, Kirkland Signature. And this is the one that actually breaks the pattern. Costco's hot dogs, both the packaged Kirkland Signature Franks sold in the warehouse and the famous $1.50 food court combo, are not made by an outside meat company at all. Costco manufactures them itself at its own meat processing facilities, one in Tracy, California, and a second in Morris, Illinois, opened specifically to keep up with demand. That wasn't always the case. For roughly 25 years, Costco's food court hot dogs came from Hebrew National, the well-known kosher brand, until around 2008, when rising costs tied to kosher certification and sourcing pushed Costco to bring production entirely in-house instead of raising the price of the combo, which the company has famously refused to do since the mid-1980s. The ingredient list on a Kirkland Signature all-beef hot dog is short beef water and a small percentage of salt, spices, and standard curing agents like sodium nitrite. No mechanically separated anything, no corn syrup, no byproducts, no fillers of any kind. The beef itself is sourced at USDA choice grade, or better. And when Costco switched to in-house production, the resulting frank actually came out roughly 10% heavier and longer than the previous Hebrew national version, eventually landing at a genuine quarter-pound per hot dog, more than double the size of a standard grocery store frank. Costco does not sell these hot dogs to any other retailer or brand under any other name. The recipe and the product exist exclusively inside Costco's own warehouses, which is part of why the food court, Frank in particular, has developed such a devoted following. People genuinely cannot get the exact same product anywhere else at any price. The company has been famously protective of the $1.50 combo price specifically, with a former Costco executive reportedly telling a colleague in a story that's been repeated by multiple business outlets over the years that raising the hot dog price simply wasn't going to happen on his watch. Whether that specific exchange happened exactly as often retold, the price itself is a matter of public record. It hasn't moved since around 1985, even as the actual size and quality of the hot dog inside that price has gone up rather than down. That's a genuinely unusual direction for a packaged food product to move in over 4 decades. Ingredient lists across this entire category tend to get more complicated over time as companies look for cheaper inputs to protect margin against rising costs, more fillers, more mechanically separated protein, more stabilizers. Kirkland Signature's hot dog did the opposite. It got simpler, bigger, and all beef. Specifically at the moment, Costco brought manufacturing in-house and cut out the middleman entirely. Owning the entire supply chain from beef sourcing relationships down to the actual meat plant gave Costco a level of control over both cost and ingredients that a company simply licensing someone else's brand name, the way Ballpark and Oscar Mayer's respective parent companies largely do at scale, doesn't have in the same way. Worth noting too, because it matters for anyone specifically avoiding certain ingredients, Kirkland Signature hot dogs are gluten-free and contain 0 artificial colors or flavors, and unlike the Hebrew national product they replaced, they're no longer certified kosher, since the switch to in-house beef sourcing moved away from the specific supply chain and rabbinical supervision that kosher certification requires. That's a real trade-off for anyone who specifically needs kosher certified food. And it's worth knowing rather than assuming, since the packaging still carries some of the visual DNA of the product it replaced. For everyone else, what you're left with is genuinely the simplest ingredient list of the 3 brands in this entire comparison, made by the retailer itself rather than licensed out to a national meat conglomerate at a price that has been artificially held in place for 4 decades, specifically because raising it was treated as a bigger business risk than the cost of the beef itself. It's a genuinely rare setup in packaged food generally, a retailer choosing to absorb rising input costs internally rather than pass them along to the shopper or quietly cut corners on the recipe. And it's a big part of why the Kirkland Signature hot dog keeps showing up at the top of independent taste comparisons against far more expensive, more heavily marketed brands sitting 1 aisle over in a regular grocery store. The verdict, so here's the actual verdict, side by side. Ballpark's classic Franks, the default version most people grab, lead with mechanically separated chicken, no beef. Oscar Mayer's classic Wieners, the most culturally iconic hot dog in the country, lead with mechanically separated chicken and turkey, also no beef. Kirkland Signature's all-beef hot dog leads with beef, water, and almost nothing else, made in Costco's own plant with no mechanically separated protein of any kind. Of the three brands this video set out to test, only one of them is actually delivering what the word hot dog probably conjures in your head when nobody's specified otherwise. That doesn't mean the other two are bad hot dogs. Plenty of people genuinely prefer the milder taste and softer bite that comes from a poultry-forward Frank. It just means the assumption baked into decades of advertising that a classic American hot dog means beef only actually holds up for one of these three names. 2 out of 3 of the biggest, most trusted brands on the shelf are, by weight, primarily poultry products wearing a beef-coated reputation they never quite earned on the ingredient panel. Nathan's Famous. Since we're already flipping labels, 2 more brands worth knowing about, starting with one that has its own genuinely wild twist. Nathan's Famous started as a nickel hot dog stand on Coney Island in 1916, founded by a Polish immigrant named Nathan Handwerker with a few $100s borrowed partly from the entertainers Jimmy Durante and Eddie Cantor. The all-beef recipe, developed by Handwerker's wife Ida, became famous enough to spawn the annual July 4th hot dog eating contest that still draws a crowd of tens of thousands to Coney Island every year. The packaged retail hot dogs sold under the Nathan's name genuinely are all beef. Ingredient list starting with beef and water. No mechanically separated anything, not far off from Kirkland Signature in terms of what's actually inside the casing. Here's the twist. Nathan's Famous, the actual publicly traded company, has not manufactured its own retail hot dogs since 2014. That year, Smithfield Foods signed an exclusive license to manufacture, distribute, and sell Nathan's branded hot dogs in the United States, Canada, and Sam's Club locations in Mexico, a licensing deal set to run until 2032. In January of 2026, Smithfield announced it was going further and acquiring Nathan's Famous outright for approximately $450 million, securing the brand permanently rather than just licensing it. Smithfield itself is a subsidiary of WH Group, a Hong Kong-based company and one of the largest pork producers on earth. So the specific hot dog brand built around a 1916 Coney Island immigrant story associated as strongly with New York City and American Independence Day tradition as any food product in the country is on its way to being fully owned by a company headquartered on the other side of the planet, having already been manufactured under license by that company's American subsidiary for over a decade. None of that changes what's actually in the package today. The ingredient list is still genuinely clean, still all beef, still close to what Nathan's has always been. It's simply another example of exactly the pattern this entire video keeps circling back to. The story printed on the front of the packaging, immigrant grit, Coney Island tradition, a nickel hot dog stand that became an American institution, and the actual corporate structure behind that packaging can diverge completely without either one being false. The hot dog itself hasn't changed. Who profits from it and who ultimately controls its future very much has. It's genuinely one of the more surprising ownership stories in this entire category, precisely because the brand's identity is so tightly wound around a specific immigrant story rooted in one specific New York City neighborhood, which makes the current ownership map feel a lot further from that origin story than a single glance at the packaging would ever suggest. Applegate is the other name worth knowing if what you actually want is an organic or grass-fed option rather than a conventional one. Applegate specializes in hot dogs made with 100% grass-fed beef, sourced from farms in Australia and California, packaged in a natural casing, and the ingredient list is about as clean as this category gets. Beef water, a small amount of salt, and natural spices, with no synthetic nitrates or nitrites, relying instead on celery powder. As the naturally occurring source, the same substitution most of the brands in this video have also made in their own uncured lines. Applegate has been part of Hormel Foods, the publicly traded company behind Spam, and Skippy peanut butter among dozens of other brands since Hormel acquired it in 2015 for $775 million. That's a large conventional parent company sitting behind a brand that built its entire identity on being the natural, humanely raised alternative to exactly that kind of large conventional meat company, which is a familiar shape by this point in the video. What's different here is that, unlike some of the acquisitions in this comparison, Applegate's actual formulation appears to have stayed consistent since the sale. No reported reformulation toward cheaper inputs, no quiet swap toward mechanically separated protein. The organic and grass-fed sourcing claims are backed by third-party certifications that require ongoing verification, not just a company's own say, so printed on the front of the package. Applegate hot dogs typically run noticeably more expensive than any of the three main brands tested in this video, often close to double the price per pound of a Ballpark or Oscar Mayer product, which is the honest trade-off for grass-fed beef, natural casing, and a shorter, cleaner ingredient list. Whether that premium is worth it depends entirely on what you're actually looking for. If your priority is finding the leanest possible ingredient list with organic certification behind it, Applegate is one of the more consistently reliable names in the mainstream grocery aisle for that specific goal, even sitting under the same broad umbrella of large-scale corporate meat ownership as almost everything else in this video. It's a genuinely useful reminder that a large parent company and a clean ingredient list aren't automatically opposites in this specific aisle. It just takes checking each specific product rather than assuming either the best or the worst based purely on the size of the company signing the checks. The one thing worth remembering. So here's what this entire investigation actually comes down to. In the end, Ballpark and Oscar Mayer aren't doing anything illegal, and mechanically separated chicken and turkey aren't dangerous ingredients. The USDA regulates exactly how that meat can be recovered and processed, and plenty of people genuinely prefer the taste and texture of a poultry-forward hot dog to an all-beef one. This isn't a safety story. It's a story about a gap between decades of advertising and cultural assumption on one side and a genuinely simple 5-second check on the other. Read the first ingredient on the package before it goes in your cart. If the first word is beef, you're getting beef. If the first words are mechanically separated chicken or turkey, you're getting a completely different product, no matter how classic or iconic the name printed above it happens to be. Of the three brands this video specifically set out to test, Kirkland Signature is the only one where the name, the price, and the actual ingredient list all point in the exact same direction. A genuinely simple, all-beef product made in-house at a price that hasn't moved in 4 decades. Ballpark's classic Franks and Oscar Mayer's classic Wieners are both, ingredient for ingredient, built primarily around mechanically separated poultry, not beef, regardless of what either brand's decades of advertising might have led you to assume walking down that aisle. And if you want to go a step further than any of the three brands tested here, Nathan's Famous and Applegate both offer genuinely clean, all-beef ingredient lists too, each with its own separate story about who actually owns them sitting quietly behind the label. Next time you're standing in that specific aisle at any store, the habit worth building is genuinely simple. Skip the mascot, skip the jingle stuck in your head since childhood, and just read the first word on the ingredient list. It'll tell you more about what's actually in your bun than 50 years of advertising ever will. 3 brands walked into this comparison with roughly equal name recognition. Only one of them actually walked out with an ingredient list as simple as its reputation.